Well, we're beginning our reading in risk management, and it's risk management and introduction. And it is exactly that, just an introduction. In fact, it's I find such a weak introduction that it leaves you wondering what this whole thing is about. It makes it sound very abstract and very difficult to implement. When actually it's fairly straightforward. There are some clear trade-offs, and there are some good reasons why risk management matters, both to portfolio management, and let's just move away from portfolio management altogether, because this reading on risk management isn't so much about financial risk management, but enterprise risk management. Why, as an analyst, do we really care about ERM, about enterprise risk management? Isn't that a really technical operational issue? Well, think about this for a minute. How do we value a firm? Well, if we use the present value method, we take all our future cash flows and we discount them at some discount rate. Well, what's wrapped up in that discount rate? It's a measure of risk. So if a company can present itself as less risky by talking about its ERM process, its risk management process, and how it manages risks, and if you read a 10K, you'll find that information in there. And we can assess whether or not the company's got it, whether or not they're on the ball. How do they manage their risks? Do they have a robust risk management program in place? And if they do, well, suddenly that discount rate doesn't need to be so big. It can drop a little bit and valuations increase. Remember, one of the rules of cash flows is less risky cash flows are worth more. And since risk is such a subjective thing, we try to objectify it by using historical data and saying, here's a measure of uncertainty, standard deviation, variation, look at that. That's how we measure risk. But in the end, when we're looking at a business and we're looking at business-specific risk, sometimes you're not going to capture that risk. Sometimes it's a subjective component. So if a nice explanation of a company's ERM process can lower that subjective risk in the mind of the analyst, higher valuations. If it can lower it in the mind of a takeover candidate, higher valuations. Now let's move over to the portfolio management, which is the reading we're in. This reading doesn't really push the financial side very much. It doesn't really get into that. And if you're interested in financial risk management, there is actually a designation called the FRM, the Financial Risk Manager, that you can get that goes heavily into it, but it's really quantified. So in terms of portfolio risk management, I don't want you thinking in terms of just the financial risk in what you're holding. Think about any fund and what are the risks it faces. Well, it has people risk as well. It has analyst risk. It doesn't just have financial risk, it has a whole bunch of risks as well. So an enterprise risk management system, even for a hedge fund or a mutual fund, isn't just about finance. So when we look at an ERM system, we should not expect to find risk management primarily the purview of the CFO and just a financial thing, and that's it. And we're going to see how we link all these risks to big, broad company objectives. So let's start from kind of that background a bit, and let's just jump into risk management, and I'll try to flesh it out as best I can as we go along. So our first learning objective, LOSA, is to define risk management. And to do that, I first got to put a couple of ideas in your head so that when we define risk management, you have an idea of what it is that we're looking at. We're not looking, when most people think risk management, get rid of risk. No, that's not what risk management is. In fact, that's the opposite of risk management. It's not to get rid of risk. And so let's begin here. So back in quantitative, we sort of took a stab at risk, and we looked at risk, and we came to the conclusion that risk was the effect of uncertainty. And we measured uncertainty in terms of a standard deviation. And we looked at a distribution of possible outcomes, and the dispersion of those outcomes we measured as standard deviation. We said, there's our measure of uncertainty. So the risk is not the uncertainty itself, it is the effect of the uncertainty in our objectives. If risk had no effect on us, let's say there was uncertainty in something, but whatever the consequence was, didn't bother us, didn't affect us, doesn't hurt me, then it's not a risk to me. So a risk of an earthquake in Antarctica, yeah, it's there. And it's uncertain whether there's going to be an earthquake or not. But there's no effect on me or any of my objectives, hence it's not a risk. So for it to be a risk, it must have an effect on your objectives. That uncertainty must have an effect on your objectives. So we can list thousands of risks, but let's think about our objectives. What risks will affect those? That's the purview of risk management. It is a deviation from expectations. And because we're looking at the effect of uncertainty, it can either be positive or negative. That sets up the problem of risk management. When you manage risk, you're managing both the upside and the downside. We really don't want to do that. Have a look over here. We said that the dispersion of the possible outcomes we measure by standard deviation, but these dispersions could be really good for us. This side of the distribution, let's call that opportunity. Look at all the opportunity up here. But down here, I don't want that. That's risk. Let's get rid of this. Let's try to manage that. Now, the belief is, or kind of a naive view, not a belief, but a naive view, is that to manage risk, what you want to do is you want to decrease the standard deviation. You want to decrease that dispersion. So if you do, you end up with something like this. And you can continue to decrease it, and that's fine. But look at this point over here. Eliminating all risk is undesirable. You may prevent the erosion of value, which is this side, but you'll also prevent value creation, which is this side. So I want to keep this distribution. I want to keep the big distribution, but I want to do something down here. I don't want to eliminate the risk. I want to manage that risk that exists. So risk management really is not about making this distribution so tight as to have no variation, because no risk, no return. You must take on risk, right? So we can look at risk in terms of the risk of an event happening. We've already seen that in quantitative, the probability of some event, or the risk of a consequence. So that we've undertaken a specific course of action, so we have our E, and we're worried about a specific consequence happening, which is a conditional probability. So the risk of an event that hasn't happened yet that may happen, or the risk of a consequence that once an event is undertaken, some outcome will happen that we don't like. And when we talk about risk, we're really looking at the left tail. But remember, you manage the left tail, you're going to manage the right tail. And that's not what we want to do. So that sets up a conversation going forward. Let's move on. So we'll introduce some terminology here on our way to finally getting a good understanding of what risk management is about. Let's talk about risk exposure. Risk exposure is how much risk we are currently taking. And there are two ways to look at our risk exposure. We can have acceptable and planned risk, and wrapped up with that is unacceptable and unplanned risk. So when we look at our risk exposure, we will be exposed to some risks that we say, yeah, we knew that. That's acceptable and that was planned. And there may be some other risks where we go, well, that's not what we want. We kind of just want this over here. This is unacceptable. That was unplanned. That's what we want to deal with. This, we've accepted that level of risk. This is not what we want. So let me give you a very, very naive and simple example, but that will make the point. I'm in Canada, and I'm looking at the price of corn for September delivery, and I think at $3.60, it is way too low. I think that we're going into a summer, there's going to be droughts, I think it's going to be a terrible harvest, all sorts of reasons why, but I think $3.60 is too low, and I also think that, well, there's not much downside if I'm wrong. I'm willing to take that risk. So I want to go long one corn contract for September at $3.60, and the ticker is ZC. I want to go long one for September at $3.60. I am willing to accept the price risk. That's the bet I'm willing to make. If I may set a stop out at 330 or 320, saying, well, that's all I want to lose. I'll manage the downside loss. But that doesn't mean I'm managing the risk. I'm managing the downside loss. I still have price risk. Here's what I don't want, though. This is a U.S. contract. As you see, that's a U.S. dollar contract. I have Canadian funds. The current exchange rate is 126.5. I'm okay putting my Canadian into the U.S. at 126.5 and betting on this. What I do not want is currency risk. Unacceptable risk is the currency, because here's the deal. I don't expect the Canadian dollar to weaken against the U.S. over this period of time. In fact, I expect it to strengthen. So in other words, I'm making a bet that I know I want. I'm betting on the price going up. But wrapped up in that bet is going to be a bet that the dollar, the exchange rate, will stay the same or get better for me, and I think it's going to get worse. I don't want that risk. That is an unplanned and unacceptable risk. So my acceptable risk is price. I don't need to protect myself from that. I'm willing to take that risk. I'm not going to manage that risk. I'll manage my losses by putting a stop loss, but I won't manage my risk. The unacceptable risk is the currency. I don't want that risk at all. So now I've identified my risk exposure. My risk exposure is price and Forex. My risk appetite, that's a new word, that's a terminology, and it's not very well defined. Even in practical use, even professionals out there that are ERM experts, if you ask them to define risk appetite, there's no one accepted definition. But my risk appetite is price. You can think of risk appetite as what's acceptable to you given what you're about to do. Price. Okay, so that's my acceptable. That's my risk appetite is price, but my exposure is price and Forex. So my risk management really only deals with Forex. Not all the risk, just the risk that I don't have an appetite for, which is Forex. Now, if I also believe that the Canadian is going to weaken against the U.S. over the course of the summer, I might say, you know what, I got two bets wrapped up in one. I'll take exposure to both. But I do not want to make this bet. I want to make this bet, but I do not want to make this bet. There's where risk management steps in to take away my unacceptable risk and bring me just back to my normal risk exposure, my risk appetite of what I want, my acceptable and my planned risks. So, with all that terminology and that background behind us, we're ready to answer our first learning objective, which is to define risk management. And here we are. And there's a very a particular word I'm going to underline because I want to draw your attention to it. Risk management is the process. It is a process. It's not just a one-time deal where you set up an ERM system and there it is, it's done. It is a process. A process by which the level of risk that should be taken is compared to the level of risk that is actually being taken. You can think of that should be taken as your risk appetite, and that is actually being taken as your risk exposure. So it is a process by which those two things are compared and brings the two into congruence. So this is your current risk exposure. This is your target risk exposure. Wrapped up in your current risk exposure is both planned and unplanned risks. Risk management steps in to bring you from current risk exposure to your target risk exposure. And here, wrapped up in here, is just your acceptable levels of risk. So risk management really is to deal with the unplanned and unacceptable risks. It's not about predicting risk either, but about being prepared for unplanned risks. Also, it's not about minimizing risk. It's about taking acceptable risk and only acceptable risk. So I hope that you get that point. This is the big point on risk management. Risk management is not about minimizing risk. It's about taking just the acceptable risks that you sign up for and none of the other stuff. That's risk management. So risk management does not prevent losses. I think I made that clear in the corn contract example. I'm willing to take price risk, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be right. I could still lose. Putting a stop loss in is managing my losses. That's not managing my risk. I still had price risk. I left that fully in place. I had price risk. I was managing my losses. If I want to manage my price risk, when I buy the corn contract, when I go long, I would immediately sell a call on it, so that if the price did drop, the call would pay for my loss. But I'm also limiting my opportunity now. I sold the call, which means I can only enjoy some upside to corn. Get that? I've managed the price risk, which means I've managed the opportunity as well. So risk management does not prevent losses, but those losses should be acceptable losses, and they should be losses from acceptable risks. I certainly wouldn't want to win on corn just to lose on the currency. Now, I'd hate myself at that point. 4 main elements to a risk management process, and this is the process that we're looking at, not the risk management framework. The framework has a whole bunch of components. We'll get to that. This is just the process. Number 1, identification. You got to identify your risks, and we'll look at that from 2 perspectives. From a bottom-up perspective, the people on the front lines who know risk best, and a top-down perspective, those at the management and board level who say, look, all those little risks are fine, but you got to align them with our strategy, right? Assessment. Once you've identified those risks, how do you assess risk? How do you measure this stuff? Most of it is rooted in probability. But we learned in quantitative that some probabilities are very subjective. Some risks defy quantification. Some risks are just a gut feel, experience, really subjective. Well, how do you assess that? How do you deal with somebody's, I think this is what's going to happen scenario, right? Now, somebody at the bottom saying, I think this is going to happen can be ignored. Some prominent board member saying, I think this is going to happen, you can't ignore that. You got to deal with that. But how do you manage that, right? So identification and assessment. This will start to define your current risk exposure. Beautiful. Once you get there, if there's a deviation from your risk appetite, you move on to step 3, mitigation. And then once you mitigate, you begin to monitor, because sometimes when you manage an unplanned risk, that doesn't mean it's gone away. It means you dealt for it today. You may have to continually dynamically alter your hedge depending on what it is you've hedged out or what it is you've insured yourself against. Conditions may change. Not only that, one risk never shows up on its own. Risks travel in packs because they're all connected. When one risk shows up, chances are it's pulled a lot of the other risks with it. So you have to monitor all of your other exposures to see what's going on there. 3 and 4. This is moving towards, trying to continually move towards your target risk exposure. So your current risk exposure, identification, assessment, you deal with it with mitigation and monitoring. That's the heart of risk management. We're on our second learning objective now, LOSB, which is to describe features of a risk management framework. So now that I think we have a good, solid understanding of what risk management is and what it isn't, how a risk management framework now is, how do we get that kind of thinking into the organization? And we said there were 4 main processes behind risk management: identification, assessment, mitigation, and monitoring. But that doesn't happen in a vacuum. You need some kind of institutional framework in which that happens. That's what this is. It is a formal way to respond to risk. It's the infrastructure, the processes, and analytics required to support the risk management function, and it covers risk governance. That's at the board level. And we already, in corporate finance, we talked about corporate governance, and I did mention in one of the slides just briefly that one of the committees is a risk management committee. But we didn't go into detail about what that looked like, but we know at the board level there is a risk management committee. Risk identification and measurement. How do we do that? What's in place to do that kind of thing? Is that somebody's job? Do I got to do it? Risk infrastructure. And we'll go into more detail about all of these. I just want to get through them. Define policies and processes, if this, then that kind of thing. Risk monitoring, mitigation, and management. What's in place for that? Communication. People who can spot risks on the front line. How do they get the word up the channel? People at the top trying to keep all these risks aligned to objectives. How do they communicate down? and strategic analysis or integration, taking all these risks and saying, yeah, okay, you've identified a lot of risks, but does that matter to what we're doing? How do we integrate all those risks into our own strategic analysis? If I have a certain objective, you can identify a whole bunch of risks in isolation, but bring them back to the objective. Is it a risk to my objective? Maybe it isn't. Maybe it isn't, which means it's a risk, but it's not our risk. If you want to know more about the risk management framework and what's involved in a more generic sense, the International Standards Organization, ISO 31000, has codified standards for risk management. So you can simply just Google ISO 3100 if you want to get more detail, and you'll get very generic standards for risk management that don't apply to any one business, but that cover ERM in a very generic way. So let's briefly just talk about each of these elements in the risk management framework. We start with risk governance. This is at the level of the board of directors. Typically, a risk management committee would be set up. Some of the board members would sit on this committee. They define the risk appetite of the organization in alignment with its goals. And at this level, this is where you get the E, the enterprise risk management, because they're not looking at all the little tiny risks here and there, and there's this risk and that risk, and this risk of this supplier and of this customer group. They're not looking at that. They're saying, what are the main goals and objectives of the organization? And they define the risk appetite that is in alignment with those goals. We're not going to worry too much about what does that look like? We just want to know that that is in there being done. Then we move on to risk identification and measurement. This is an ongoing process, identifying risk exposures, calculating risk metrics. And when we're calculating risk metrics, what we're really doing is we're calculating the probabilities of all the possibilities, and scanning for potential risk drivers. And a risk driver is any factor that gives rise to a risk that is relevant. Remember, it has to matter to my objectives. So let's say that I'm a student going to university, and my objective is to obtain my 4-year degree. That's my objective. And somebody says, well, there's a risk of climate change. That doesn't affect my objective. So yeah, that's a real risk, and I'm really concerned about that, and I'll do what I can to be part of the solution. But that's not a risk driver to my success at a 4-year school. That's not a risk driver. So it's not a factor that gives rise to a relevant risk. There's lots of risks out there. You have to bring that risk back to your objective and say, yes, that's a risk, but would it affect my objective? And if the answer is no, it's not relevant, it doesn't need to be managed. Our third element was the risk infrastructure. And this is really just the people, the systems, and the technology that's required to track risk exposures. And when we talk about the technology, it's not just the physical hardware that's used. It's different databases, different models that are used to track our risk exposures, and the process of risk capture. How do we actually objectify this risk exposure? So let's say that we track some particular risk exposure. Well, how do we define that risk? How would we objectify that risk or quantify that risk? Typically, it would be the use of historical data. Well, you got to get that historical data into the system, into the database, and into the models to start using. Well, there's a whole bunch of problems with doing that. So this infrastructure that's in place, most corporations would subcontract this out to an ERM implementation specialist or an ERM company like an SAP. Policies and processes. This translates risk governance into day-to-day operations and procedures. Remember, risk governance comes from the top down. And it's aligned with the strategy and the goals of the organization. Well, it can't be abstract. The people at the bottom, they don't like that. They want to know, hang on, if it's this, then what? So in translating it into policies and processes, you end up with statements like, if X, then Y by doing Z. So if X happens, then do Y, or achieve Y by doing Z. This tells you to mitigate how. So if something happens, you need to mitigate. If X happens, then mitigate by doing something. Check W every Q hours or days, and this is updating or monitoring. So again, ongoing process, right? Do A every B units of time. something like backing up. Perhaps you have a critical database or some information that's particularly important that is part of your operational success, and it's critical. Well, the risk is, well, it could get hacked, it could get lost, it could an employee could walk away with it. So that's where that comes in. Do A every B units of time. So these are just examples of what policies and processes would look like. Taking the abstract and putting it into concrete action gives you these type of action statements. Next is monitoring, mitigating, and management, and this is really the action words of risk management. Risks evolve, they come and go, so you must always be monitoring, always be mitigating whenever unacceptable risks show up, and that's where the management part of it comes in, is managing just those unacceptable risks. Then there's communications. Well, if you have a governance committee, a board committee for risk management, setting broad risk policies for the organization, and you have people on the front lines that are exposed to these risks every day, that see risk everywhere, how do you bring those two into congruence? How do you get the ones that information at the bottom about risk to the top? And how do you get that information at the top about, hey, yeah, there's a lot of risk, but bring it back to an objective? How do you get that message down? Well, you need a communication system, right? Governance parameters must be communicated downwards. Risk metrics must be communicated upwards. Risk issues revised and discussed. And there must be a feedback loop to the governance body so that the parameters can evolve, since they set the parameters. If the environment is changing, if these metrics are moving in a direction that they can't see, if the issues are becoming different than what can be seen at the top, there has to be some way to get this information back up, which is why when we define risk management, I underline that one word. I'm going to write it again: process. You have to design a risk management framework that flows, that is itself a process, that allows for this type of communication. Strategic analysis and integration. The governance body defines goals of the organization and determines its risk tolerance. Great. So when we're looking at all the different risks, again, you might spot a bunch of risks in the marketplace, and you might have two broad objectives. Well, the goal of this whole process is to say, well, this risk ties to this objective, this one over here, this one over here, and maybe this one over here. But these, yes, they're risks. We've identified them as risks, but they don't really tie to any objective. They're not relevant. So you may have risk identification, but to bring it in, to integrate it into the strategic analysis, you've got to bring them back to those big, broad objectives that are defined at this level. So just to wrap up the last point on strategic analysis and integration, management executes goals and provides a risk management framework. When we say they provide a risk management framework, that means they put the proper resources in place to make sure that a risk management framework exists. The right people, the right processes, they've invested in the right technology, etc. But they provided the risk management framework. So now the organization goes ahead and risks are identified and measured. Then they're monitored, then mitigated if they're outside acceptable parameters. This is the important stuff. What are you mitigating? What's outside acceptable parameters, and how often is it showing up? That gets communicated back up to the management level. Depending on how bad or how big or how much this is, it may lead to modifications to risk exposures, where management says, you know what, we no longer want to be there. We're spending way too much time putting out fires. We no longer want to be there, which may lead to a change in the allocation of capital. So some benefits of a risk management framework: lower probability of being surprised by an event. Even in your own lives, think about it. If you sat down on a Sunday morning with a nice tea, not coffee on a Sunday morning, you want tea, no sugar, and you said, okay, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to think about my own life. I'm going to list all the risks to my life and all the risks that could happen. It doesn't change their happening. And it doesn't change the probability of their occurrence, but it does change the probability of being surprised by an event, because you could foresee some risks and say, there are some things I can do now to mitigate that. You're playing less defense, and you're making fewer errors because you're not responding, you're not putting out fires. When we put out fires, you know what? We throw everything at it to put it out. We're not thinking clearly. More discipline, better consideration of the risk-return trade-offs, faster response, smaller losses. So the benefits are huge. So we're moving on now to LOSC, keywords here, define and describe. Define risk governance and describe elements of effective risk governance. And I'm going to stay very true to the reading and the LOS objective here, which is just to get to the point, only because when we start down this path, the chapter is very light. I can go very deep on this, but it's not going to matter. It's not going to help you at this point. For those interested in more, there's the ISO 3100 standards that you can look at, or if you're going to go on to do the FRM, you're going to get a lot of it there. So let's just get to the point on this learning objective and keep moving forward. When we talk about risk governance, we're really looking at a top-down process. This is at the level of the board, level of management, and it's a top-down process that provides guidance from the board that keeps management actions, this is the risk management part, keeps management actions and organizational goals into alignment. So at the level of the board, at the level of risk governance, they're really looking at the entire entity as a whole, and not all of the little tiny operational units that may face specific risks. They're looking at what the risk profile is of the organization in terms of its goals and meeting its goals. So the board determines two things here, the organization's goals and priorities, and in determining those goals and priorities, it also sets the organization's risk appetite and tolerance that allows it to attain these without getting in the way. So all of the risks that filter up to the top from the bottom, all of the identified risks that filter up to the top, get placed into three broad categories. Well, first, what risks are acceptable? What are the acceptable risks? That's what we're in business for. We'll take those risks. What risks need to be mitigated or hedged? What risks are there that we can easily take care of? And what risks are simply just unacceptable? Now, these unacceptable risks may not be easily mitigated, so it may call for a reallocation in the capital budget away from certain projects if the distribution of the risk or of the uncertainty in the payoff begins to change. It may change those budgets. So we place them into three broad categories: the ones we can take, the ones we can deal with, and these ones that we just don't want to have anything to do with. And of course, the board provides ongoing risk management oversight. Again, remember the key word we used earlier. If you keep this word in mind, you'll get a better feel for how this whole process works. Process, right? Risk management is a process. It's not just a one-time deal. So, of course, you're going to have oversight because that is part of the process. The desirable properties of a risk governance system. It should provide a sense of the worst loss that can be managed. Not the worst loss that will happen, but the worst loss that can be managed. Clear guidance, balanced with execution flexibility. Now, what this is saying is that you don't want to set guidance so tight that as risks evolve and as they change and as they emerge and disappear, that execution flexibility is constrained to doing this and that. Because, again, it is a process. Risks come and go, so you want that flexibility at the lower levels. The focus should be on, and this is the big one here, the focus should be on enterprise risk management. Now, you may have a corporation with multiple divisions, and one division looks at something on the downside and says, that's a risk for us. But another division says, but that's not our risk. That's our opportunity. That's what we're in business for. So if one tries to eliminate that risk, they're actually hurting another division. That's why you have to look at it in terms of the enterprise as a whole. The objectives, the health, and the value of the whole is important. So I'm going to give you an example down here of how we would look at risk from the top level. Let's say that there is a fund that wants to invest in a particular company, and there's always risks in investing in a particular company. But it just so happens that this fund is a pension fund, and the company that it wants to invest in is the sponsor of the pension fund. So at the level of the investment, you can look at the risk. But at the level of the fund itself, you will say, well, hang on a second. The company that we're looking at is also the sponsor of the pension plan. All employees have exposure to the company as a result of employment anyways. So yes, while we can hold the company and while we're willing to take that risk, suddenly when you look at it from a whole point of view, saying it's not just the investment anymore, it's the fact that the investment is a company of which all the beneficiaries at some future date are currently employees. Does that change the risk? So that is risk at the level of the whole. So a fund manager at that point would probably say, look, it's a good investment, but unfortunately it ends up with concentrated risk for our members simply because they're already exposed to that company. If that company turns bad, not only does it hurt the pension fund, but it also hurts their employment. So the question, should a pension fund hold shares of a sponsor's stock, is something you would find at the level of the whole as opposed to just evaluating the risk of investing in those shares independently of who's going to receive the benefits, right? Other desirable properties, a risk management committee, and sometimes the risk management committee is either a subset within the audit committee or associated very closely with the audit committee, or one and the same thing. And the presence of a chief risk officer or a CRO. We're now moving on to our next learning objective, which is LOSD. Keyword here, explain. Explain how risk tolerance affects risk management. So let's start off with, first of all, defining what risk tolerance is. It is the extent to which the entity is willing to experience losses. Number one, experience losses or opportunity costs, meaning we're willing to give something up in pursuing something. So we're willing to experience losses or opportunity costs and fail to meet its objectives. So in other words, if we fail, we're willing to take this risk. That's our tolerance. I think that's fairly clear. It defines the entity's risk appetite. And remember this word here, nobody's really comfortable with the word risk appetite. My appetite, I have no appetite for risk, but I'm willing to take on risk. It's like liver. I have no appetite for liver, but I'm willing to eat it. I just, if you ask me what I want, it's going to be last on my list. Hey, do you want risk? No. But I'm willing to accept it. So I'm not a fan of the word risk appetite. No one has an appetite for risk, maybe other than a gambler. But I prefer the word tolerance. What kind of risk will I tolerate and in order to meet my objectives? So if I fail, I'm willing to accept that. There's risk tolerance right there. So in order to define your risk tolerance, you really have to look at two sort of areas, internally and externally. So we need to look at our internal factors and external factors. And internal factors, we're looking at the question, what shortfalls within the organization would cause it to fail to achieve its critical goals? Liquidity or experience. Experience is a big one. It's probably bigger than most people assume. Venture capitalists have figured this out, by the way. When you look at how VCs make decisions, one of the biggest risks that they'll define for an investment, they're investing in illiquid companies. You would think they would say liquidity. It's not. Their biggest risk in investing in any company is execution. Does the management team have execution intelligence? Do they know how to execute on the plan? Great plan, we'll buy into the plan, but can they execute? Because you can take a somewhat okay idea with a great management team with great execution, and they'll make it wonderful. But you can have a great business plan with a management team that can't execute, you've got nothing. They'll tell you it's experience, the execution experience that matters. It's the same with any business. If you lack the experience to do a particular thing, that's a big problem. Even if you have experience, guess what? That experience can walk out the door and be taken away. So you have to think about that. That's a shortfall that would cause it to fail to meet its critical goals. So you have to identify what are those shortfalls that would cause it. Externally, what in the external environment would cause us to not achieve our goals? Is there something about the currency? Interest rates, does a change in interest rates affect us? Once you have those, then you can begin to define what your tolerance for risk is. Once you know, what internally and what externally will cause, and it's this thing right here, fail to achieve critical goals. It's not a matter of defining a whole bunch of internal risks. some of those internal risks that you define still would not allow the company to fail to achieve its critical goals. One of them would be to make sure that payroll is exact and executed on time. Well, if it's off, if you have mistakes in payroll that can be fixed, you won't fail to achieve critical goals. So not every risk should be identified. Only those that fail to achieve your critical goals. Once you know internally and externally, you can begin to say, okay, what can we live with now? What is our tolerance? Not that we have an appetite for it. What is our tolerance for risk? So as I said on the last screen, our first point here, once you have your internal and external factors identified, once the board has done that, they can begin to define the dimensions of the risk they are unwilling to accept. Once we know everything, and here are all the risks, you go through the list and you say, okay, well, these are the ones we signed up for. These ones we can mitigate very easily. These ones over here, I'm unwilling to accept that. We should not be willing to accept that. Now management comes into place to manage that risk. Factors that can affect risk tolerance, and we'll look at factors that can affect risk tolerance to the higher side, knowing that the absence of these affects it to the lower side. So when as an organization, am I willing to raise my risk tolerance, the level of risk I'm willing to take, or my tolerance for that risk? If I have a very strong competitive position in the industry, then I'm okay. I don't have to worry about losing market share. And if I do, I could probably get it back quite easily. I'm in a superior position in the industry. I can take a little bit more risk, especially in innovation. The greater the loss that can be sustained. My greater response agility, my speed of being able to respond, my expertise in responding, the flexibility that I have. So we can see that the presence of an ERM system and a very effective ERM system can actually raise an organization's risk tolerance. And finally, things that we should ignore, personal motivations and beliefs. Beliefs are just somebody saying, well, I think this is going to happen, I think that's going to happen, without much backing behind it, because they have a certain feeling for something. Well, unless you can actually bring it to the goals and objectives, unless it actually is something that we can deal with, then those sort of things should be ignored. We're on LOSE. Keyword here is describe. Describe risk budgeting and its role in risk governance. And this is the one I find that people have the most trouble wrapping their head around, risk budgeting. But isn't risk this thing that's subjective and difficult to quantify sometimes? Isn't it based on historical observations? When you setting a risk budget, aren't you setting a budget for some unknown event in the future? How do you do that? With dollars, we know how to set a budget with dollars. So many dollars here, so many dollars there. But risk? Well, let's see how that works. So we have our risk tolerance that we've already been through. We know what our risk tolerance is. We have acceptable versus unacceptable risks that we were able to identify. So with the acceptable risks, we want to get rid of the unacceptable, but the acceptable risks that we take, quantifying and allocating tolerable risks to various activities and investments. That's risk budgeting. Let's say it again. We quantify and we allocate risks to various activities and investments. So there we go. So let's skip all of this down here, run right down at the bottom of the screen. Let me see if we can't clear this up right now. And let's look at what risk budgeting is and what capital budgeting. So we'll start with capital budgeting. When we do capital budgeting, the portfolio weights that we choose are based on security return contribution. So that we may say, well, so much in this particular asset class, so much in that particular asset class, based on the expected return that we expect. We expect one asset class to outperform, we will overweight that asset class. We expect another asset class to underperform, but we need it, we would underweight that particular asset class. I think we get that. So that we're weighting assets in a portfolio based on what we expect them to return. That's called capital budgeting. We're putting dollars towards specific asset classes and over or underweighting them based on what we expect. Risk budgeting, the portfolio weights are determined based on security risk contribution. So you may say, here's the level of risk that we'll tolerate. That's it. That's the level of risk we'll tolerate. So this asset class provides us with this much risk, so we'll allocate so much money there. This asset class provides this much risk, so we'll allocate there. So the weights on your investments are determined based on the contribution to risk, hence the term risk budgeting. You set a limit for how much you want to budget on risk, and then you allocate it to specific asset classes until you've